Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar on behalf of Tamarack and the city's Deepening Communities team. Today, we're here to discuss monitoring happiness and community well-being. We have seen shifts in happiness across the world, and the pandemic has changed the shape of happiness globally. How do Canadians fare, and how do we measure happiness? Today, as the first part of our series on happiness, we are introducing the concepts around happiness, and we're sharing recent research and trends in Canada on happiness. We will also be exploring its relationship to well-being and what does this mean when we put a community lens on happiness. As part of exploring the ideas around happiness and community, we need to acknowledge our past that leads to barriers for happiness and fulfillment. I'd like to begin with acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have continued to take care of this land. For those of us who identify as settlers, our recognition of the contributions and historic importance of the Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I am joining you today from the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe people, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We welcome you to share where you're joining from today. We know that we have people visiting from all over Canada and beyond. And so we'd like to share a map of where everyone is joining us from. And as we've already invited you to introduce yourself in the chat, please do share where you're calling in from. This is a good idea of who's in the room. We have people from all over the world, and so we're really delighted to be welcoming you today to this session. A reminder that you can use the chat box to write any comments, to share any thoughts, and also the Q&A box to share particular questions that you'd like to direct at our speakers today. Please join me in welcoming our two presenters for today's webinar. We have Oksana Kishkuk and Richard Jensen joining us from Abacus Data. Oksana works with clients at every stage of a research project, including the creation of qualitative and quantitative research tools, project management, and data analysis. Oksana has experience working for clients with a millennial focus and a growing portfolio on a wide variety of public affairs files. Oksana has previously worked at a public affairs research company. The Saskatoon Health Region evaluated management practices through qualitative and quantitative research, and the House of Commons, gaining experience with several public policy files. Oksana holds a Bachelor's of Public Affairs and Policy Management with a specialization in Strategic Public Opinion and Policy Analysis, and a Master's degree in Political Management, both from Carleton University. Also joining us, we have Richard. Richard's 20+ years of experience in research includes work with some of Canada's top research firms and a 10-year+ stint running his own boutique research firm. Richard has extensive experience in public affairs, policy development, branding, customer experience, and employee experience research for some of Canada's leading public and private sector organizations. As a published peer-reviewed author and with more than 200 public opinion projects led, Richard has a deep understanding of research methodologies, project management, and statistics. What sets Richard apart is his ability to unearth digestible insights from quantitative research and present them in a meaningful way to clients. In addition to extensive work with governments and professional associations, Richard has worked with companies and not-for-profit organizations in telecommunications, finance, and health. Richard holds an honors and master's degree in political studies from Queen's University and a doctoral degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. Welcome, both of you. We're really excited to hear what you have to share about your research and how it's applicable to shining a community lens on happiness. So I'll now hand it over to you, and you can run the show with your presentation.
Thanks a lot. And thank you, Tamarack Institute, for inviting us to be part of this. Happiness is something that passionately care about. I think is really an important indicator here. What we're going to do today is have a bit of a conversation about what happiness is and how it can be measured, and some of the data that we gathered over the last 9 months or so to really give a sense of how happiness could really um, help as a way of thinking about communities. So please ask some questions at the end. We're really interested in hearing about your views.
I am, oh, there we go. Oh, no. Connor, would you mind switching the slide? Thank you. Awesome. Yes, my practice did not pay off. Awesome. So a little bit more on the sort of areas that we're going to dig into a little bit this afternoon, and the conversation that Richard and I are going to kind of have. But then again, please do jump in with your questions throughout. First, we're going to talk a little bit about how we measure happiness, especially how we're measuring happiness here at Abacus Data and our happiness monitor, the kind of core questions that we've chosen to ask, and how those all kind of work together in sort of shaping a bit of an index that we've been tracking. Then we're going to have a little bit of conversation about predictors of happiness. How does happiness relate to different demographics? What do we know about how people's lives sort of shape how they're happy? And then transitioning into a little bit about, now that we know about sort of what makes that variable, what can happiness indicate? Is there a relationship between happiness and mental health? Is there a relationship between happiness and how people have endured COVID? Is there a relationship between community relationships and happiness? All those sorts of things, a couple case studies to sort of wrap up our conversation. So just to begin, a little conversation about why we became interested in happiness in the first place. And Connor, if you wouldn't mind switching the slide again. Thank you.
You know, Oksana, when we started this, we both wanted this project when David first presented it to us, the topic, and we launched this in October of last year, in sort of the midst of the pandemic, what we thought was near the end of the pandemic, and that didn't quite turn out to be the case. And we've now asked the happiness questions 22 times. And for me, one of the reasons why this was such an interesting topic was that we never really thought about how to measure something as unique as happiness. And for me, that was a real challenge. I don't know if you felt the same way, Oksana.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, when we were talking about it, it's kind of this like topic that's very fluffy in a way, and that like, are you happy? Are you not happy? And it just seems like something that you talk about at the beginning of a meeting with someone and kind of move on, and just like, it's a very intangible sort of fluffy thing. But it was really interesting to be able to sort of quantify it a little bit, and be able to sort of then track it and see how it moves over time, because I think it's, and we'll get into it a little bit later, it really does track with other things as well. And it really is something that you can measure, and I would argue should be measuring, to look at a whole bunch of other different variables in your community.
Yeah, like in a way, happiness does seem such a light or a thin concept, but it really is deeply personal, and because it's deeply personal, it's really a motivator. And to me, that's what's been really interesting about this, is that really all the decisions we make as human beings are related to that search for happiness, avoidance of pain, and so because of happiness is a really interesting idea. And we've talked a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the pandemic and happiness, and the mental health impacts. But that to me is a really interesting thing. And we've even had countries now talking about happiness as an indicator, just like GDP is, because if you're being successful as a government, what's the better measure, GDP or how happy your actual population? So that's been really interesting.
And I think how happiness even, I mean, to get into a conversation, if GDP is something worth measuring and productivity and things like that, the topics might not seem related or measuring the same kind of thing, but I think they really are. We've seen when we look at sort of a happiness metric, people's involvement in their community is really tied to whether or not they're happy, and that's kind of a whole cyclical relationship. So I think they're both definitely kind of on the same scale of why you'd want to be tracking them. All that sort of thing. So just to, I guess, get into a little bit about how we measure happiness, at least how we sort of shape our own happiness monitor. We've asked 8 questions. So the first is kind of like our core measurement of happiness. So we ask a 10-point scale of happiness. So it's there on the left there. So on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is miserable and 10 is extremely happy, how happy are you right now? We get people to sort of self-assess where they are at that point in time. We convert this into a scale out of 100 just to sort of get rid of that decimal when we're looking at things like that. So you'll notice kind of on the other slides, they're on a number of 0 to 100. And then we are also really interested in looking at beyond just whether or not people say they're happy or not, what are the other drivers of happiness? Happiness is linked to a lot of different things. When we ask someone if they're happy or not, that's great, but then also the why, like what is driving that happiness? And so we've come up with these kind of key drivers that are on the slide as well, that we also ask. So these are agree, disagree statements that sort of follow that initial question. And this sort of sum of questions makes up the monitor and the numbers that we're tracking. So there's a bunch of different statements here, and we found that those top 3 on the chart there really sort of embody and track very similar to the generic metric of happiness. So whether or not someone agrees that they're living their life to the fullest, whether or not someone says, I wake up most mornings excited about what the day is bringing me, and whether or not they're very optimistic about the future. All of these sort of outlook on life sort of aspects really do sort of drive and are very much related to how happy someone is. The other ones are have somewhat of relationship. Life is very rewarding and I'm very fulfilled by my relationships with others. So speaking to that community bit, also drive a little bit, but those top 3, especially predictions and future outlook, are really sort of driving that in. I don't know, Richard, if that was maybe surprising to you, or these were the sort of things you saw that would fall out back in October?
In retrospect, it doesn't feel that surprising because they really capture the kind of purpose that a person has and the feeling that one can fulfill that purpose. And so in that sense, I think it turns out to be not that surprising. It'll be interesting to know as with the pandemic if some of those other things start bubbling up and becoming more important, which we'll certainly be tracking.
I think that's interesting, especially for living life to the fullest. Like I think of in my own life, the things that I would be doing to live my life to the fullest, I haven't been able to do for the last year and a half. And so is that maybe something that is sort of driving that? Well, I will be happy when I can do those things because there's this challenge in the world where we might not necessarily be able to. Is it going to sort of stay that way? That sort of thing. I'm interested to see how the very rewarding sort of piece tracks kind of post-pandemic as we get out of that, because I think that's kind of the other sort of piece in that argument, and that if you sort of find that you are fulfilling those pieces, life may become more rewarding.
For sure. And you know, if we look at the tracking, we've now asked this a lot of times. 22, I think, is the number, and we started in October and we basically ended, I think, last week. I think we have it on a survey next week. All these samples are 1,000 to 2,000 people. One thing to keep in mind here is that this is an average, not a percentage. And so unlike a regular chart question, we're not saying 62% are happy at a particular time. We're saying that the average happiness at that point is 62 or 65. And so differences of 2-3 percentage points are really kind of meaningful change. And you can sort of see that overall, we're a little bit happier this spring than we were back in the fall. And we've really tracked very closely to sort of the low moments of the pandemic in Canada. You know, the 59.8 that occurred in early March was basically the realization that we were going into a third wave potentially, We had a bit of a reprieve when a few things opened at the end of March. And then when we entered the third wave, we were down at 60.7, the third lowest that we've ever recorded. Optimism, we got into the period, but we're still not really out of it. And but the pandemic has really driven a lot of the changes.
Yeah, I think the other one that's interesting to me on this chart is kind of right around the November, December area. And that was really when we were talking about vaccines. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was like, okay, by the end of the year, we're going to have a vaccine and it's going to roll out production and we'll get vaccinated. And kind of the end of the year was at least kind of the timeline that I was sticking with to sort of get through everything. And so you can kind of see it starts to kind of drop, I think, towards the end of the year once we aren't really getting that news. And then we start getting the news of sort of the efficacy of vaccines is great and things can go into production and it kind of rises back up. And so I think that's another kind of interesting example of how our mood is really tracking, especially in the pandemic. It's been interesting to track happiness, but it's kind of interesting to see those news events really shift how that line is moving.
Yeah, I think the 59.4 was right after the premise that Canadians weren't going to be at the front of the line for vaccines. So that is certainly true.
Yeah, and then I think of kind of like in the sort of spring, it's really a bit of a roller coaster. And I think that's kind of when people were sort of grappling with whether or not they'd get their lives back and what timeline they'd kind of see it at, to be able to have all those things about living your life to the fullest, having a rewarding life, having relationships with others, being able to see your neighbors again, all of that kind of stuff. I think it's interesting to kind of see it go on a bit of a wave as we're sort of working our way out of the pandemic and trying to figure out kind of what that looks like on the other end.
Yeah. And one of the things, and the obviously profound thing that jumps out of here when we look at the demographics of happiness, and this is from one of our recent surveys, but it's basically been fairly consistent all along, is that young people are expressing much less happy people 16 over. This is a dramatic difference. To me, I always think of young people as having more hope and more optimism and being better, more happy and more thinking their life is all in front of them and everything's going to be great. To me, to see this consistent sort of low levels of happiness is a challenge.
Yeah, it definitely kind of goes against the sort of typical what young people sort of think. And initially I was surprised about it too, but I think it kind of goes back to those drivers and what kind of happiness is. And I think that one of the possible reasons for it is that maybe young people have a lot of unchecked boxes that they haven't been able to sort of attain and to get those sort of life moments and get those rewarding and feelings of optimism if you have a good job, if you're kind of on track to getting all of those boxes ticked off. If you're younger, those things might not be set in stone yet. They might not be kind of there. I think on the other side, employment being kind of another predictor and that sort of thing, I think sort of speaks to that stability piece as well. And that if you kind of have everything sorted, you can then sort of focus on those other aspects in your life that bring you happiness, as well as having those basics covered. I think definitely seeing that sort of number change between unemployed and employed, that certainly has an impact as well. And so I think that's kind of the same thing that's happening with young people, is that they might not have all of those boxes checked, those certain aspects taken care of before they can kind of rate their happiness at a 71, like those 60 plus retired folks that we're seeing in the surveys as well.
Yeah, there's no question that employment, being retired certainly helps in your happiness. As someone is looking forward to that happening sooner rather than later. And income to some extent is certainly a factor here. It's kind of worth thinking about. The urban-rural divide isn't huge. Urban people are a little less happy than rural people. But one of the interesting things we did was we had asked a bunch of questions back in March about move out of the urban cores to a more rural place. And there was a real appetite for this, driven by this sort of work from home notion. And one of the things that was really striking was we had asked happiness at the same time, and the people who lived in the most urban locations who wanted to move out, they wanted to move out because they were really unhappy. And it really was a sign that to some extent, urban locations aren't delivering the promise of what life could be, or what people really want their life to be. And an interesting thing that I explore some more over the next few months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it sort of, I mean, the demographic trends, there are certainly some, but they're not as many as we might have expected. And to be able to sort of break the data down and be able to sort of say, like, on these questions you ask on the census, this sort of guarantees you're happy, this is not. And I think that sort of speaks to, on one hand, what happiness is really measuring. It's measuring a lot of those maybe more intangible things, maybe things that aren't necessarily key demographics that we can sort of track and ask kind of yes/no questions on a survey, but also kind of on the other end, what it means for what we can then learn about what happiness is that if it's sort of picking up on these sort of subtleties in our communities and these other sort of aspects that we aren't necessarily able to sort of get from just demographics, and saying that maybe men are more happy in this aspect than women and that sort of thing. If there's these more nuanced sort of approaches by looking at happiness and measuring the happiness of Canadians, we're able to sort of get those more nuanced perspectives on different other aspects. I think of things like civic engagement was one of the other things that we sort of looked at in one of our releases on happiness, and looking at whether or not people who are civically engaged, so people who vote, are happy or not, or if there's sort of a difference. And that was one of the things that I saw in some of the research that I'd been looking into when we first started this in October, is that there's quite a bit of a relationship. People who are more civically engaged are happier. And we saw that in our own data as well. We did kind of a fun piece on if you vote a certain way, are you happy or not? And there really wasn't that many differences between people with different political affiliation, but what really stood out was people who weren't voting were quite a lot less happy than people who were voting. So I think that really speaks to kind of people's connection to their community, to their wider community, to their country. To be able to sort of say those two things are linked is something that's really interesting. Just jumping into kind of the case sort of study section, we, like Richard mentioned, and we've talked about a little bit already, we've been sort of tracking these questions on surveys where we've had the opportunity to look at different sort of aspects of happiness and how it kind of tracks on different questions. One of the things that I was really interested in exploring back in November is what about happiness and mental health? When we are talking about kind of the phrase happiness, a lot of the times I'm immediately sort of jump to mental health, and that if you're happy, you're happy. If you're happy, you're happy. If you're happy, you're probably kind of secure in your mental health, and all that they're very much tied. And I was interested in figuring out if that was actually the case or just kind of an assumption that I had. So as you can see on the screen, there are quite tied. So on kind of one side is people's self-assessment of their mental health, and then sort of their mean happiness score. So you can see that there is quite a strong relationship between people who sort of rate themselves as having sort of good mental health are happier. And I think that while maybe was something that is a given, is something that we can be able to sort of look at and figure out what that means sort of for society and people being able to manage their mental health and things like that. So on the same survey, we asked if a bunch of different statements about, so not only whether or not their mental health is good or not, but if they're able to sort of navigate these situations and find resources and find support for when they are in those situations. So we asked individuals if they feel like the statement describes them, that they can easily navigate situations where they feel stressed or anxious, or kind of a correlation between mental health. And what we found is that people who are better able to manage a stressful situation are happier. So people who say that they can manage these all the time have an average happiness score of 72, compared to people who say that they can't do this at all, which is around 54. But what's interesting is that the inverse relationship applies as well. So happy people are better able to manage a stressful or anxious situation. So I think it's really interesting to sort of see just sort of one aspect of what happiness can be tied to, and can, if we're asking people on surveys or in our own communities about whether or not they're happy, I think it can really predict and sort of indicate the mental health kind of capacity of the individuals in the community as well. Richard, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one or sort of go into the next example.
I just think it's just interesting that it says a lot about when you're thinking about community engagement and community activities to try and stronger communities, that one of the challenges, people that are most happy are perhaps the ones who are the least in need, and potentially accessing some of these services and building stronger communities is somewhat trying to attack those and get at those people who are the least happy and maybe the least feeling like they can have control of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to that sort of, a lot of the things that we're looking at are a bit of a cycle, in that if you're happier, you do X or think X, and then if you do or think X, you're happier. And you can either get stuck in the cycle of a good cycle where you're happy and all of these things are coming true for you, or not, and you're not happy and all of these things aren't coming true. You're not able to manage your mental health is lower, all of those different sorts of things. So I think it's just one example of kind of that cyclical relationship between happiness and other metrics that we're interested in looking at.
And because happiness is so easy to measure in our minds, it really becomes a very powerful way of thinking about how a community is doing. And this was, I found this really interesting. We've been tracking questions on the pandemic in the last year and a bit than we've probably asked on any other topic in the history of Abacus. And I just picked this out because I think it's telling in the sense that back in April, if you said the worst of the pandemic was behind you, then 67, you're at 67 points on the happiness scale. If you thought the worst is still to come, you're only at 59. Now, since April, so April to June, the percentage of people think the worst is behind us has risen dramatically. We really, we're now double dosing most people. We're at almost 80% of eligible with first dose. So you would think that category is better. Well, it's bigger. The worst is now behind us is a bigger category, but they're based on level of happiness. Part of what happened over the course of the last, April to June was that people moved from the worst is still to come, or I'm not sure at this point, and moved up to, well, I think it's over. And that generated more happiness. But what's striking about that is that there's still lots of people who think the worst is still to come, and they're mired in quite less happiness overall. And to me, that's a kind of telling story about how the pandemic has influenced happiness.
Yeah, I think it's a great sort of case study, and whether it be that the pandemic sort of spurred the creation of this, or how that all relationship came to be. I think it's really interesting that we're able to sort of track these metrics during this time. And also, I think most interestingly for me, is to be able to track it sort of going out of the pandemic, and how our transition back to life as we knew it, or maybe life as we knew it, sort of shapes how we move into that space, and how our happiness sort of tracks during that time too.
Yeah, because we know happiness is one of the things we don't really know about happiness is how much we have sort of norms about how happy we are, and we fluctuate based on new events, or how much the pandemic lowered the overall amount. And so that's something we're definitely interested in. These are some results from the recent survey, and I think this is interesting because of the way vaccination got tied to happiness. And it's a little bit different than the previous slide, in that the people who have already had at least one shot are the happiest. That's people who think it's going to take, will take it as soon as it's really available to them, which 62, which is increased to the adult population. But the people who are hesitant, particularly, I prefer not to take it, but could be persuaded to, or will not take it under any circumstances, are the least happy. And that makes, that notion of being less happy actually, I think, makes it harder to overcome the public health messages that would encourage you to get vaccinated, because it's that unhappiness is actually generating a sort of resistance to those kind of positives.
Mm-hmm. I see a lot of parallels sort of in this question, and that sort of whole topic about civic engagement and engagement with your wider community. I mean, a lot of the messaging about vaccinations is to take it so that you're immune, but a lot of it is about herd immunity and that whole concept of protecting your community and protecting your neighbors. And so I think it's really interesting that if we sort of take that sort of community lens on sort of vaccination and being vaccinated, people who are more involved in their community are happier. They're sort of more connected. They're sort of feeling that sense of duty to their neighbors to get vaccinated, compared to those people that kind of don't really feel that sort of connection and desire. And I don't know if that's extrapolating a lot or a little bit, but that's kind of something that stood out to me when looking at this slide, and those sort of two groups that were very sort of clear cut about whether or not they kind of want to join in the crowd and help out or not.
Yeah, it's like the unhappiness among people who are sort of wanting to get vaccinated is actually part of the barrier to them not getting vaccinated and also not being happy. Like, it seems like it's related to the same thing. Yeah,
it's again like stuck in those two sort of cycles about if you're connected and happy and in the happy crowd, you're more willing to give back and get more happiness out of it compared to whether or not you aren't. One of the last sort of, I guess, case studies or sort of examples that I thought would be good to end on is sort of most directly tied to community and happiness, kind of out of all the research that we've done. So we asked this question on one of our surveys back in January this year, asking, since the pandemic began, would you say that you have felt, and then one of 4 options. So just bear with me as I kind of describe the different sort of options, and then I'll kind of get into what they mean. And so we gave people 4 options. The first was that since the pandemic, would you say that you felt more connected to both your own community, so people sort of self-defined personal network, their friends, family, social support, things like that, and more connected to your wider community. So things like your neighborhood, sort of the whole concept of community overall. The next was people who felt more connected to sort of that inner circle, but more disconnected from the wider community. Then we asked, or more disconnected from your own community, but more connected to your wider community, or people felt more disconnected from both. So you could pick any one of these 4 answers. And looking at kind of the responses and different sorts of levels of happiness, there's also sort of 2 categories with this question as well. So people who throughout the pandemic have felt more connected to their sort of social support circle are much more happy than people who felt disconnected from these supports. Interesting to note is that people who felt disconnected to both also feel similar to people who feel disconnected from their own community, but more connected to their wider community. And so for me, I think this question really speaks to making sure that in communities and neighborhoods and those sorts of spaces that people's community is really strong, and so that they can consider it as their own community, their social support network. When those networks are bigger, when those networks are strong, when those networks involve people in your neighborhood, in your physical community, things like that, it's likely that that sort of strength of that connection will help you weather the events such as the pandemic, but then also contribute to happiness. I think that's a really interesting sort of relationship, and sort of shows that really fostering those strong connections in community, that they go beyond just someone's wider community, really do sort of have an impact on how people measure their own happiness.
Yeah, it's almost like community is one in which people also have strong personal connections that are deep enough that they act as an individual support rather than just being a positive community that I like to live in. And that certainly sort of bears out here, that your community has to sort of fulfill you in some way at a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe like a small C community versus sort of your actual community, and that the difference between how people define both of those is very clear to me in looking at sort of how people define their happiness. And so being able to sort of include more community in what people describe as their own community is likely to sort of have an impact on happiness and whether people can weather events like the pandemic.
Well,
so I think that's what, kind of, well, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
I was just gonna say, that's kind of what we wanted to cover. I hope we've given you some ideas about how happiness can be thought about in terms of, and how it kind of works as a measurement tool. But I'll turn it over to questions. People have them.
Thank you, Richard and Oksana. That was really, really fantastic and fascinating in how you've been able to shine a light on the relationship between community and happiness, and that strong relationship with mental health, and connect all of this to the pandemic and follow along with some of those trends. And really, it was fascinating looking at those demographics and seeing really, maybe challenging some of our assumptions about maybe who is happy and who fares best or worse amidst the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. But of course, the importance of community is really, really strongly connected there. We are going to move into some questions, and I have my colleague Dan here, who is going to hone in on some of those pieces you were talking about, and delve deep into questions and bringing in some audience questions as well. So over to you, Dan.
Perfect. Thanks, Al. And thanks, Richard and Oksana. We do have a wide range of questions that are coming from our participants. So again, to remind everyone, if you did have a question for our panelists, you can have them in our Q&A chat box area. And if we don't get to all the questions, we'll hopefully be able to follow up. And so I wanted to start off by talking about the idea of a message that's actually from Jennifer Payne. So it's talking about how do you compare or differentiate those measures of happiness versus community well-being? And they describe the Canadian Index of Wellbeing Domains and Indicators or the Wellbeing Economics Alliance as an alternative or a more holistic measure of the quality of life or success over GDP. So for either Richard or Oksana, wondering if you could answer that question.
Well, I think one of the values of this was that it's capturing a community perspective, because you can obviously aggregate this to a variety of levels of aggregation. And so you could ask this at a local community level. You're getting at a real personal endpoint, like what, at the end of the day, how do you actually feel? Or is your life getting better or worse? And I think one of the interesting things is to be able to start tying that to some of these other indicators, because of our ability to then understand what are the levers we best need to pull in order to really have results that create more meaningful and deeper communities.
And I think just to sort of add to that, I think like looking at those sort of domains, they track a lot of different things that we're interested in looking at how happiness is related to. So I think of like democratic engagement as an example, being able to sort of see how happiness tracks with that and is related to that, I think is really interesting. And from our end, as much as this was kind of just an interesting project to sort of track happiness and see what it was related to, I think it sort of shows that happiness is something that can be tracked and can be tracked relatively easily, at least in our opinion, with kind of what we've developed. But then it can also predict a lot of different things. So you can look at whether or not if people are happy in a community, there's probably indications of there's good participation in civic engagement, there's probably good participation in community activities, different things like that. And so really to sort of come at it with a bit more of a holistic approach and say, how can we measure it on an individual level, and how does that speak to sort of what resources are available in the community? I think there's a lot of sort of relationships and ways that both sort of metrics can really tie and complement each other.
That's great. And I love thinking back to the quote that Robert Kennedy said, where he was talking about how GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage or wisdom or learning, compassion or devotion to our country. It measures happiness as a measurement that's going forward, going beyond GDP. And I do have another question here from Elaine around the idea, did people generally feel that they had control over their levels of happiness, or were they waiting for it to come to them from an outside source like community?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think something that we sort of talked about in length and really shaping kind of what we're measuring, and that was why those sort of extra sort of drivers beyond just whether you're happy or not were so important for us to be able to see how they sort of tracked. I mean, I don't know, I guess, is part of the answer, but also I think one sort of clue is that the fulfillment with relationships with others isn't necessarily one of the core sort of drivers that we found out of all the statements we asked. It was more likely people's personal outlook on life, whether or not they're optimistic, whether or not they're feeling like they're living life to the fullest, things like that. And I think relationships certainly could be a part of that, but it's very personal. And I think it's sort of a personal sort of concoction of different things, likely not driven by relationships alone. But I think interactions with the world and how the world is interacting with them certainly impacted. I think an example of that is looking at how it tracked throughout the pandemic, and reactions to sort of different events. I think there's certainly outside influence, but there's also sort of a personal innate, how you're sort of consuming that information, consuming those relationships, and then letting that form your own happiness.
Yeah, and I think we don't ask about control per se, really, but this really strong relationship, happiness, and feelings of mental health would suggest that happiness is related to a bit of a sense of a lack of control over one's life. It's worth thinking about some more for us, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a relationship, I think, between maybe not control per se, but that stability, I think, is maybe what that mental health sort of angle is looking at, is if they can sort of, if your mental health is, if you say it's good, you're likely to be happier. And what I would perceive from that mental health sort of indicator is that people are feeling sort of confident in how they can sort of assess situations that are given to them and sort of navigate through life. So in that aspect, I guess, potentially a relationship as well.
Thanks. And I have a couple questions that are asking around the inspiration for your monitor. So the ideas around what research did you pull from the United Nations Human Development Index and the World Happiness Report in informing your approach towards gathering this data? So really asking how are other indexes influencing how you developed a happiness monitor?
Well, it's fair to say that we looked at those things afterwards, after we decided that we were going to come up with something. And in part because, market research firms like ours, we track lots of things, and we were looking for something new and interesting to do. And because it was a pandemic, and because mental health is a challenge, and we do a lot of things with young people as a research topic, and so we were really interested in knowing how they were feeling, and happiness seemed to just resonate. But we definitely consulted with the World Happiness Report stuff, looked at it, and thought about it in terms of how we came up with this.
Yeah, I think I would second that, that we kind of each did our own personal research, but I think it's because it's a topic that initially seems so sort of fluffy and maybe something that isn't necessarily quantifiable, at least from first glance. I think a lot of what we did in development, kind of the benefit we have of being a research firm, is that we can almost test out hypotheses, especially with those statements. Some of them came sort of from research and looking at what other people had done, and other ones just came from sort of hunches or assumptions that we had about what makes happiness. And so we were able to sort of test a bunch of those and sort of figure out which ones actually were tied to people's happiness and which ones weren't.
And I have a question here that's relating towards diving into the demographics that you've studied and talking about different ages. It was really interesting to see that incline as older demographics are being monitored. And so I have a question that's related to older populations and their level of happiness. So as you're finding that happiness increases as people's age increases, it's surprising that we commonly hear that older people are often feeling isolated. And then that's been heightened by the pandemic. Wondering if you could talk about that sample and have any form of discussion.
I will just, I guess, to kick off that conversation, I think it's important to note that, so the demographics that we were looking at, that age group is 60 plus. So I think when we've certainly seen in our own research on sort of a variety of different topics about how older people have been affected by the pandemic, that certainly those older demographics within that 60 plus have definitely felt that sort of isolation and mental health impacts of the pandemic. But for that slide in particular, it was 60 plus. So sort of looking at people in that post-retirement stage. So I think that sort of encapsulates a bit of a larger swath of people's life stages. Perhaps a large proportion of that group is people who are sort of in that retirement, life goals have been fulfilled sort of stage of their lives. And so I think that's the people in that demographic are probably what's pulling that number up.
And I think I would just add that the whole idea, part of the thing about the demographic slides is that even though the age thing is different, one of the things that we really pull out of this is how significant thinking about where they actually live and their total life experiences and actually probably driving that experience. So yes, I think we talk a little bit about seniors and older people be feeling more isolated during the pandemic in some circumstances, but there's also others who have strong connections with friends and family and stuff that they've built over generation or years and years, and so they actually weathered it reasonably well, and they weathered it quite well financially in many ways. And so I think it's too easy to generalize a little bit about what that age difference is in terms of, because so much of it is where those people live and what their total sort of community impacts are.
And that ties into another question that we had that was relating to the intersections between demographics. So do you have any results that relate to multiple intersections of different demographics?
We haven't done work on that. We've done it a little bit piecemeal here and there, but we haven't yet focused on trying to figure out whether, what's the impact of low-income seniors versus high-income seniors or that kind of thing. It's certainly an area which we have enough data to do, but we just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, and I do have a question that's relating to working within community and the idea of, we've heard this quote used within Tamarack where it's no numbers without narratives and no narratives without numbers. So I really like the idea of having happiness grounded in some form of data and having numbers to back up and having an evidence-based approach. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for people who are working, in community on a local level, how to bring forward the ideas of measuring happiness and how to actually have this evidence-based approach to help support their work.
I mean, from a practical standpoint, I think one of the benefits of being able to measure happiness in the way that we've done is that if you have a survey or some sort of measurement tool, it's fairly easy to sort of throw the kind of question on and ask and be able to sort of gather a whole bunch of different insights on sort of community health and individuals' health. I think it's definitely something that if you're already measuring other sort of aspects of your community in a quantifiable way, I think it's certainly worth including this type of measurement on. I think going back to kind of that quote that you just mentioned, for me, happiness is really a way to sort of merge those two worlds. We work at research, and there's kind of those two distinct sort of areas. There's that qualitative and quantitative piece, and often a lot of times to tell a story, right, you have to be able to sort of include both aspects. And so I think being able to include questions like these on surveys that often include sort of hard and fast quantitative numbers is a really good way to sort of get at those maybe soft sort of qualitative insights as well.
And I think it's really interesting because to try and think about ways to including those kind of questions on tools and data at community level, in part because when there's intervention to improve various things at the community level, whether that's social housing or some other services, some of those won't happen immediately, and asking people is a good way of sort of tracking how those changes are actually having a real impact on things. Providing social housing or providing various things, or access to services, or improving the green space or the community spaces, they might not immediately change some of those hard indicators, but they might start, you might be able to start picking up on positive outcomes of those things with a measure like ours. And in so doing, you're arming yourself with the things that are having an impact on people's lives. And I think that's the real kind of thing that we wanted to accomplish in sort of having this kind of, and talking about happiness as a community level thing.
Well, thanks everyone for the bringing in the questions. I think that's about as much time as we have for our Q&A. And so I want to thank again Richard and Oksana for joining us. I'm going to pass it off to Elle for, she has some final announcements before we finish off here today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. We'll just close off in the last few minutes with a few announcements. The first being just a little overview of City's Deepening Community. If you're looking for more information about being part of our network of communities that are committed to strengthening neighborhoods and fostering positive community change through resident-led action, please visit our website. We support communities through communities of practices, webinars, events, publications, and provide that specialized support for our members. Feel free to reach out to Dan or myself for more information on the city's Deepening Community Network. And for some upcoming webinars in particular, we will be following up with sort of a part 2 to this series on happiness. We're going to delve deeper into happiness and exploring it more as a follow-up to this webinar today, and it will be a private webinar, so you will look out for an invite for that webinar, and we'll plan that for August. And we hope you'll join us for some other upcoming community building webinars. We do have one on socially connected communities in August as well. So that can all be found on our events page of our website. And in particular, we'd like to invite everyone to join us on October 6th to 7th for a live and timely national conversation as Tamarack's learning community convenes to discuss how we're going to rebuild social connection after the pandemic. This event is titled Reconnect, Making Community Essential, and information can be found on our webpage, and that will provide other information as well about how to register. Feel free to reach out to Dan or myself for further information on that. So today I'd like to thank everyone as we wrap up. I'd like to thank all of you, all our participants, for engaging in the conversation and asking some really important questions, and really for participating and showing up today. We appreciate you dedicating an hour of your time to us today. And I'd really like to extend a special thanks to Richard and Oksana for joining us today and sharing some really important research and insights. I'm really inspired by a lot of the opportunity that comes from this research, just the real life examples and what we can do with what we're learning from happiness and that connection with community and the importance of community. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and watch out in your inbox for a follow-up email with some more information on our upcoming events, as well as on the video, the recording for today, and some notes from today. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.